The rain hammered against the tin roof of the farmhouse like 1,000 impatient fingers, each drop a reminder that the world outside was alive, while Margaret Castellano sat alone in the dim light of her kitchen, watching the storm devour the evening. She was 83 years old, a widow for 12 years, and the last living soul on a property that had once buzzed with the laughter of children, the arguments of farmhands, and the steady rhythm of a life built on hard work and simple faith. Now there was only silence, punctuated by the creaking of old wood and the distant howl of wind through the valley. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the rotary phone on the wall, the same avocado-green relic that had hung there since 1972. The numbers were worn smooth from decades of use, and her eyesight was not what it once was. She squinted at the scrap of paper where she had written her nephew's number, the one he had given her 3 Christmases ago when he still pretended to care. She needed to hear a voice, any voice, before the loneliness swallowed her whole. Margaret dialed slowly, deliberately, counting each rotation of the dial. But somewhere between the 3rd and 4th digit, her arthritic finger slipped, and she completed the sequence without realizing her mistake. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. She almost hung up, convinced that Michael would not answer, that he was too busy with his life in the city to worry about an old woman and her fears. Then the line clicked open. Silence. No greeting, no automated message, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice cracking with disuse and emotion. "Hello? Michael. It's Aunt Margaret. I'm sorry to bother you. I know it's late, but the storm is so bad tonight, and I just needed to hear someone's voice. I haven't spoken to anyone in days, maybe weeks. I lose track sometimes. The doctor says my heart isn't strong, says I should have someone checking on me, but you know how it is. Everyone's so busy. I don't want to be a burden. I just get so scared sometimes that I'll go to sleep one night and won't wake up, and nobody will know for days, maybe weeks. They'll find me here alone, and it'll be like I never mattered at all." She stopped, her breath catching in her throat, surprised by her own honesty. The silence on the other end stretched, and she wondered if the line had gone dead. Then a voice came through, low and deliberate, a voice that carried the weight of gravel roads and late-night decisions. "You're not a burden." Margaret blinked, confused. The voice was not Michael's. Michael had a reedy, anxious tenor, the voice of a man who spent his days in cubicles and his nights worrying about mortgages. This voice was different. It was calm, almost gentle, but beneath the gentleness was something else, something forged in fires she could not imagine. "I'm sorry," she said, her confusion evident. "I think I've dialed the wrong number. I was trying to reach my nephew." "You did," the man said, "dial the wrong number, but you reached me instead." Margaret felt a flutter of panic, the instinct of a woman who had lived through enough years to know that the world was full of dangers, especially for the vulnerable. "I apologize," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I'll hang up now." "Wait." The single word stopped her hand mid-motion. There was no command in it, no aggression, but it carried an authority that made her obey without thinking. "What's your name?" he asked. "Margaret. Margaret Castellano." There was a pause, and she heard the faint sound of something in the background. Maybe a chair creaking, maybe footsteps on a wooden floor. "Where are you, Margaret?" She hesitated, every cautionary tale her mother had ever told her flashing through her mind. But there was something in his voice that made her answer, something that felt less like danger and more like recognition, as if he already knew the answer and was simply waiting for her to confirm it. "I live on a farm," she said slowly, "about 40 miles outside the city, near the old mill road. It's been in my family for generations. I'm the only one left now. Are you alone?" "Yes. My husband passed 12 years ago. We had no children. There's just me now." Another pause. Then, in that same measured tone, "You shouldn't be alone tonight. Not in this storm." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, not from fear but from the unexpected kindness in those words. She had not realized until that moment how desperately she had needed someone to say something like that, to acknowledge that her solitude mattered, that she mattered. "That's very kind of you to say," she whispered, "but I'll be fine. I've weathered worse storms than this." "Maybe," the man said, "but that doesn't mean you should." Before she could respond, he spoke again, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more practical. "Is your address listed?" "Yes," she said, still not understanding where this was going. "It's the only Castellano farm on Mill Road. You can't miss it. There's a big oak tree out front and a white fence that needs painting." "Good," he said. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "Someone will be there soon. Don't be afraid." "What?" Margaret's heart lurched. "No, you don't have to do that. I didn't call for help, I just needed to talk to someone. Please don't trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," he said, and there was a finality in his voice that told her the decision had already been made, that whatever was going to happen was already in motion, and nothing she said would stop it. "You said you were scared of dying alone. I'm making sure that doesn't happen tonight." Before she could protest further, the line went dead. Margaret stood there, the receiver trembling in her hand, her mind spinning with confusion and a strange, inexplicable hope. She told herself that it was a prank, that whoever she had called was playing a cruel joke, that nobody would actually come. But deep down, in a place she had not visited in years, she felt something stir, something that resembled faith. She hung up the phone and returned to her chair by the window, staring out at the storm. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the darkness beyond the glass was absolute. She tried to convince herself that nothing would happen, for that she would sit here until dawn and then laugh at her own foolishness. But she could not shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. Time passed. She did not know how long. Her sense of hours and minutes had grown unreliable, a side effect of living alone with nothing but the rhythm of the sun and the demands of hunger to mark the passage of days. She dozed in her chair, her head nodding forward, and when she jolted awake, the storm had lessened to a steady drizzle. That was when she saw the lights. At first, she thought she was imagining it, a trick of her tired eyes and the rain-slicked glass. But then the lights grew brighter, 3 sets of headlights cutting through the darkness, moving slowly up the long dirt driveway that led to her house. Her breath caught. 3 cars, not 1 but 3. Big, heavy cars that looked like they belonged in a different era, their chrome gleaming even in the rain. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady, her heart pounding in a way that the doctor would certainly not approve of. She moved to the front door, her hand hovering over the lock, fear and curiosity warring inside her. The cars came to a stop in front of her house, their engines idling, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the doors opened. Men stepped out. 5 of them. They wore dark suits, the kind that looked expensive even from a distance, and they moved with a precision that spoke of training and discipline. They did not rush, did not shout, did not bang on her door. They simply stood in the rain, waiting. One of them stepped forward, the tallest of the group, a man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He walked to the base of her porch steps and stopped, his hands clasped in front of him in a posture that was almost respectful. Margaret, his voice carried through the rain, calm and unmistakable. It was the same voice from the phone. "My name is Vincent. You called me by mistake tonight, but I don't believe in mistakes. I believe you were meant to reach me. I'm here to make sure you're safe, that's all. I'm not here to harm you or take anything from you. I'm here because you shouldn't be alone." Margaret's hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was insane, that she should call the police, that she should lock the door and hide. But there was something in his eyes, something in the way he stood there in the rain without demanding entry, that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in years. She opened the door. Vincent looked at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been sorrow or recognition or both. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and then he turned to the men behind him and spoke in a language Margaret did not understand, his tone firm but not harsh. The men moved immediately, 2 of them heading toward the barn, 2 others walking the perimeter of the property. Vincent remained on the porch, his gaze steady. "May I come in?" he asked. Margaret stepped aside, her voice lost somewhere in the storm of her emotions. He entered, and the warmth of her small kitchen seemed to shift, as if the space itself recognized the presence of someone who carried authority like a second skin. Vincent glanced around, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the chipped dishes in the sink, the photograph on the mantel of a younger Margaret and a man who must have been her husband. His expression softened, just a fraction. "You've lived here a long time," he said. It wasn't a question. "All my life," Margaret whispered, "and my parents before me. It's all I have left." Vincent nodded slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Margaret felt in her chest. "Then we'll make sure it stays yours, and we'll make sure you're not alone anymore." Margaret did not understand what he meant, did not understand who this man was or why he had come. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she had not seen in another person in a very long time. She saw someone who meant what he said. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and in the darkness beyond her farm, old ghosts began to stir, drawn by the presence of a man who had once ruled an empire of shadows and blood. Vincent had come to this place seeking something he could not name, and in doing so, he had set into motion a chain of events that would force him to confront the one question he had spent his entire life avoiding. What does a man do when he finally wants to be good, but the world he built will not let him go? Vincent sat at Margaret's kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him, his posture straight despite the late hour. He had removed his jacket and draped it over the back of the chair, revealing a crisp white shirt that somehow remained pristine despite the rain. Margaret moved around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent decades feeding people, boiling water for tea, and arranging cookies on a plate that had belonged to her grandmother. She was still frightened, still uncertain, but the act of hospitality gave her something to do with her trembling hands. "You don't have to serve me," Vincent said quietly. "I came here to help you, not to be waited on." Margaret set the teapot down with a soft clink and turned to face him, her chin lifting with a dignity that age had not diminished. "In this house, guests are treated properly. That's how I was raised, and that's how I'll be until the day I die." Vincent studied her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, a crack in the stone facade. He nodded once. "Then I'm honored." They sat in silence as Margaret poured the tea, the steam rising between them like a veil. Outside, she could hear the occasional murmur of voices as Vincent's men moved through the property, checking locks, examining the perimeter, doing things she did not fully understand but sensed were meant to protect her. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on her. 12 hours ago, she had been alone, convinced that the world had forgotten her. Now 5 strangers were standing guard over her home, as if she were someone important, someone worth protecting. "Who are you?" Margaret asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Really, I mean. You're not just some kind man who happened to answer the phone. I can see that much." Vincent took a sip of his tea, his movements deliberate, buying himself time to choose his words. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "I'm someone who spent most of his life making decisions that other people couldn't or wouldn't make. I ran an organization. I gave orders. People listened because they had no choice. I built something that was feared and respected in equal measure, and I did it for a long time." Margaret's hands tightened around her cup. "You're talking about the Mafia." Vincent did not flinch at the word. Yes, she should have been terrified. Every instinct should have told her to run, to scream, to call for help. But as she looked at this man, this stranger who had driven through a storm because she had accidentally called him, she felt something else entirely. Curiosity. And strangely, a sense of recognition, as if she were looking at someone who understood what it meant to be alone in a way that most people never would. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "Why would someone like you care about someone like me?" Vincent set his cup down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where the rain continued its relentless assault on the glass. For a long time, he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost distant, as if he were speaking to himself as much as to her. "I'm 71 years old," he said. "I've been in this life since I was 16. I've seen men killed for less than the price of a meal. I've ordered things that would make your blood run cold. I've lived in a world where loyalty is bought with fear, and trust is a weakness that gets you buried. And for most of my life, I thought that was enough. I thought power and control were all that mattered. But then, about 10 years ago, Something changed. I started to feel it, this emptiness. Like no matter how much I had, no matter how many men called me Don and bent their knee, I was still just a man standing in a room by himself. He paused, his jaw tightening. I never had a family, not a real one. I had soldiers. I had men who would die for me. But I never had someone who just wanted me there because they cared. I never had someone call me and say they were scared and needed to hear my voice, and then tonight you did. You didn't know who I was. You didn't want anything from me except to not be alone. And when you hung up, I realized something. I realized that I've spent my entire life surrounded by people, and I've been alone the whole time. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, not from fear, but from the raw honesty in his words. She had expected a monster, a villain from the movies her husband used to watch on late-night television. Instead, she saw a man who was haunted, a man who had built an empire and discovered too late that it was a prison. "So you came here," she said softly, "to feel like you mattered to someone." Vincent met her gaze, and for the first time since he had walked through her door, she saw vulnerability in his eyes. Yes. They sat in silence, the weight of that confession hanging between them. Outside, one of Vincent's men appeared at the window, his silhouette barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. He gave a subtle nod, and Vincent acknowledged it with the faintest movement of his head. Everything was secure. The property was locked down. For tonight, at least, Margaret was safe, but from what, she wanted to ask? What kind of danger required 5 armed men and a former Mafia boss to protect an old woman on a forgotten farm? She did not voice the question, not yet, because part of her was afraid of the answer. Vincent stood, his movements smooth despite his age, and walked to the window. He stared out into the darkness, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "There are people who will find out I'm here," he said quietly. "People who remember what I was and what I did. Some of them will want to know why I came. Some of them will see it as a weakness, and some of them will see it as an opportunity." Margaret's heart sank. "You're saying that by being here, you've put me in danger." Vincent turned to face her, and his expression was hard again, the vulnerability replaced by the cold determination of a man who had survived decades in a world that devoured the weak. "I'm saying that if anyone tries to use you to get to me, they will regret it. I've spent my life protecting things that didn't matter. Let me protect something that does." Before Margaret could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Vincent moved with a speed that belied his age, his hand reaching inside his jacket, where she had no doubt a weapon waited. But then he relaxed, recognizing the knock, and he opened the door to reveal one of his men, a younger man with dark eyes and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Boss," the man said, his voice low and respectful. "We found tracks. Someone was here earlier tonight. Maybe an hour before we arrived. They circled the house, checked the barn, then left." Vincent's expression did not change, but Margaret saw his hands tighten into fists. How many? 2, maybe 3. Hard to say with the rain washing everything away. Vincent nodded once, double the watch. "Nobody sleeps tonight. If they come back, I want to know before they get within 100 yards of this house." The man nodded and disappeared back into the rain. Vincent closed the door and turned to Margaret, his face calm but his eyes burning with a cold fire. "You see?" he said quietly. "It's already starting." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "What's starting?" "The reckoning," Vincent said. "The moment when the past stops being the past and becomes the present again. I left that life 5 years ago. I stepped down, handed over control, and disappeared. I thought I could just fade away, live quietly, maybe find some kind of peace before the end. But men like me don't get to fade away. We either die in blood or we die in obscurity, and the world doesn't let us choose which." "Then why are you here?" Margaret asked, her voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration. "If being here puts me in danger, why didn't you just stay away? Why answer my call at all?" Vincent crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, his eyes level with hers. "Because for the first time in my life, I heard someone who needed something I could actually give. Not fear, not obedience, not blood, just presence, just the promise that they wouldn't be alone. And I realized that if I turned away from that, if I let you go back to being scared and forgotten, then I really was the monster everyone thinks I am. So I came, and yes, it's dangerous, And yes, people will come, but I'm still here and I'm not leaving. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw the truth of it. This man, this stranger who had walked out of the rain and into her life, was offering her something she had thought she would never have again. Protection, purpose, the simple assurance that she mattered to someone. And in return, whether she understood it or not, she was offering him the same thing. "All right," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then we face whatever's coming together." Vincent smiled, a rare and fleeting expression that softened the hard lines of his face. Together, he agreed. The rest of the night passed in a strange, surreal calm. Vincent made a few more calls on a phone he pulled from his pocket, speaking in low tones and cryptic phrases that Margaret could not decipher. His men rotated their positions, moving through the property like shadows, their presence both comforting and unnerving. Margaret tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every gust of wind made her heart race. She kept expecting more cars to arrive, more men with guns and bad intentions, but the night remained quiet. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the fields that had been in her family for generations, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than loneliness. She felt alive. Vincent appeared beside her, his presence as solid and reassuring as the oak tree that stood sentinel in her yard. "Good morning," he said simply. "Good morning," Margaret replied. She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for staying." Vincent nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Whoever was here last night, they'll be back. And when they come, they won't be alone." Margaret took a breath, steadying herself. "Then we'll be ready." Vincent glanced at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that might have been pride. "Yes," he said, "we will." But neither of them could see what was already in motion. Miles away, in a room thick with cigar smoke and old grudges, men were gathering, men who had once sworn loyalty to Vincent and now saw his reappearance as a sign. Some saw it as a chance to settle old scores. Others saw it as an opportunity to reclaim power. And a few, the most dangerous of all, saw it as a betrayal that could not be forgiven. The call that Margaret had made by mistake had set something in motion, something that would draw the shadows of Vincent's past into the light. And before it was over, both of them would have to decide what they were willing to sacrifice for the fragile, unexpected connection they had found in the middle of a storm. The game had begun, and in the world Vincent had left behind, games only ended one way: in blood. The days that followed were unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Her quiet, forgotten farm became a fortress, guarded by men who moved with the precision of soldiers and the silence of ghosts. Vincent remained with her, sleeping in the guest room that had not been used since her husband's brother visited 15 years ago. He was unfailingly polite, helping with small tasks around the house, fixing the leaking faucet in the bathroom, replacing a broken hinge on the barn door. To anyone watching from the outside, he might have seemed like a concerned relative, a nephew or distant cousin come to care for an elderly woman in her final years. But Margaret was not fooled, and neither were the men who watched from the shadows. On the third morning, a car arrived. It was not one of Vincent's. This one was sleek and black, expensive in a way that made it stand out against the rural landscape like a shark in a pond. It rolled slowly up the driveway and stopped at the gate, idling there as if waiting for permission to proceed. Vincent was at the kitchen table when one of his men knocked and entered, his expression tight. "We have a visitor," the man said. "Carlo Messina." Vincent's face remained impassive, but Margaret saw his hands tighten almost imperceptibly around his coffee cup. "Send him away. He says he won't leave until he talks to you. He's alone, no weapons that we can see. Says he just wants to talk." Vincent set his cup down with deliberate care and stood, his movements controlled. "Tell him he has 5 minutes. And Marco stays with him the entire time." The man nodded and left. Vincent turned to Margaret, and his voice was calm but firm. "I need you to go upstairs. Stay in your room until I come get you." Margaret bristled, her stubbornness flaring. "This is my house. If someone's coming to talk, I have a right to know what's being said." Vincent crossed the room and placed his hands gently on her shoulders, his eyes searching hers. "Margaret, the men who are going to come here, they're not like the people you've known. They speak in codes and threats. They make promises they never intend to keep. I need you to trust me on this, please." Something in his tone, a note of genuine concern that went beyond strategy or control, made her relent. She nodded slowly and made her way upstairs, pausing at the landing to look back. Vincent stood at the window, his silhouette dark against the morning light. And for a moment, he looked less like a protector and more like a man preparing for battle. Margaret went to her bedroom but left the door cracked open, straining to hear the voices that drifted up from below. Carlo Messina entered the house with the confidence of a man who believed he owned every room he walked into. He was younger than Vincent, maybe mid-50s, with jet-black hair slicked back and a suit that probably cost more than Margaret's car. His smile was wide and empty, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Vincent," he said, his voice booming with false warmth. "It's been too long. When I heard you were back, I had to come see for myself the great Vincent Salerno living on a farm. Who would have thought?" Vincent did not move from his position by the window. "You've seen me, now leave." Carlo's smile faltered just a fraction. "Come on, Vincent. Is that any way to greet an old friend? We worked together for years. You and me, we built something. You can't just walk away and pretend none of it happened." "I didn't walk away," Vincent said quietly. "I stepped down. I handed over control to the council. I fulfilled my obligations. What I do now is none of your concern." Carlo laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "None of my concern. Vincent, you were the Don. You don't just stop being the Don because you decide you're tired. You know how this works. Men like us, we don't get to retire. We don't get to play house with some old lady on a farm and pretend the world we built doesn't exist anymore." Vincent turned slowly and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Careful, Carlo." Carlo raised his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes were hard. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You disappear for 5 years, and suddenly you show up here in the middle of nowhere, playing protector for some stranger. People are asking questions, Vincent. They want to know why. They want to know if you're planning something. I'm not planning anything. Then what are you doing?" Vincent was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and measured. "I'm living. Something you might try if you ever get tired of the blood and the lies." Carlo's expression darkened. "You think you're better than us now. You think because you walked away, you're clean. Vincent, you have more blood on your hands than anyone I know. You don't get to play saint just because you're old and tired." Vincent took a step forward, and Carlo instinctively stepped back, his bravado cracking. "I never said I was a saint. I know what I am. But I also know that I don't owe you or anyone else an explanation for how I choose to spend the time I have left. Now get out of my house." Carlo's jaw tightened, and for a moment Margaret thought he might lash out, might try to assert dominance through violence the way men like him always did. But then he seemed to think better of it. He glanced around the room, taking in the worn furniture, the faded wallpaper, the simple, honest poverty of a life lived without pretense. When he looked back at Vincent, his smile was gone, replaced by something colder. "Fine," he said. "You want to be left alone, that's your choice. But you should know, not everyone's as understanding as I am. There are people who think your sudden reappearance is a threat. There are people who think you're planning a comeback, and they're not going to wait around to find out if they're right. If you stay here, Vincent, you're going to bring a war to this place. And that old lady upstairs, she's going to get caught in the crossfire." Vincent's expression did not change, but Margaret, listening from above, felt her blood run cold. "Is that a threat?" Carlo shrugged. "It's a warning, from a friend. You've always been smart, Vincent. Don't let sentiment make you stupid." He turned and walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "Oh, and one more thing. Tommaso sends his regards. He wanted me to tell you that he hasn't forgotten what you did to his brother. He says when the time comes, he's going to return the favor." Vincent said nothing, and Carlo left, his footsteps echoing across the porch. The car door slammed, and a moment later, the engine roared to life. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as the black car disappeared down the driveway, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. She heard Vincent's footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy. When he appeared in her doorway, his face was drawn, the weight of years suddenly visible in the lines around his eyes. "You heard," he said. It was not a question. Margaret nodded. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Who is Tommaso?" Vincent leaned against the doorframe, his shoulders sagging. "Tommaso Corella. He's a capo, ambitious and ruthless. His brother Luca tried to stage a coup about 8 years ago. He wanted to take over, thought I was getting weak. I had no choice. I made an example of him. You killed him." Yes, Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this. And now Tommaso wants revenge. Vincent nodded. He's been patient, smarter than his brother. He waited until I stepped down, until I wasn't protected by the structure anymore. And now that I'm here, exposed, he sees his chance. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Then we need to leave. We need to go somewhere safe." Vincent shook his head. "There is nowhere safe, not for me. If I run, he'll just follow, and anyone who helps me, anyone who gets close to me, becomes a target. That's how this works. That's the world I come from." "Then what do we do?" Vincent pushed off the doorframe and walked to the window, staring out at the fields that stretched toward the horizon. "We prepare. We fortify. And when they come, because they will come, we make sure they regret it." Margaret stood, her hands trembling but her voice firm. "I won't let you fight this alone. This is my home. If they want to come here, if they want to threaten me, then they're going to find out that I'm not as helpless as I look." Vincent turned to her, surprise flickering across his face. "Margaret, you don't understand what you're saying. These men, they don't play by rules. They don't care that you're innocent or that you have nothing to do with this. They'll use you to get to me, and they won't hesitate to hurt you if they think it'll make me suffer." Margaret walked over to him, her small frame dwarfed by his, but her presence undeniable. "Then you'd better teach me how to survive, because I'm not running and I'm not hiding. You came here because you didn't want to be alone. Well, neither do I, so we face this together or not at all." Vincent stared at her, and for the first time since he had arrived, something like hope flickered in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "All right. Together." Over the next few days, the farm transformed. Vincent's men worked tirelessly, installing security cameras, reinforcing doors, setting up perimeter alarms. They brought weapons, stockpiled supplies, and established protocols for every possible scenario. Margaret watched it all with a mixture of fear and fascination. This quiet invasion of her peaceful world by a violence she had only ever seen in movies. But she also felt something else, purpose. For the first time in years, she had a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to be vigilant, a reason to matter. Vincent treated her with a respect she had not experienced in decades, asking her opinion, listening to her concerns, trusting her judgment. And in return, she found herself caring about him in a way that went beyond gratitude or obligation. He was broken, she realized, broken in ways that most people could never understand. He had spent his life building walls, cultivating fear, maintaining control, and in the process he had lost the one thing that made life worth living: connection. The simple human need to be seen and valued for who you were, not what you could do or what you could take. And now, in the twilight of his life, he had found that connection in the most unlikely of places, with her, a widow on a forgotten farm who had dialed the wrong number on a stormy night. Margaret did not know if they would survive what was coming. She did not know if Vincent's past would consume them both, if the men he had once commanded would descend on her home like locusts and destroy everything she had left. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was not alone anymore. And neither was he. And if that was all they had when the end came, it would be enough. Late that night, as Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she heard a sound from downstairs. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. She reached for the small pistol Vincent had insisted she keep on her nightstand, her hands shaking as she crept to the door. But when she peered into the hallway, she saw Vincent standing at the window in the living room, his silhouette framed by moonlight. He was not on guard. He was simply standing there, staring out at the darkness, his shoulders hunched with the weight of memories she could not see. Margaret set the pistol down and walked downstairs, her bare feet silent on the old wooden steps. Vincent did not turn when she approached, but his voice was soft when he spoke. I'm sorry I brought this to your door. Margaret stood beside him, following his gaze out into the night. You didn't bring anything I wasn't already living with. Loneliness, fear, the slow, inevitable march toward a death that nobody would notice. You gave me something to fight for. That's more than anyone else has done in a long time. Vincent looked down at her, and in the dim light she saw something in his eyes that might have been tears. You're a better person than I deserve. Margaret reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Maybe, but you're the person I needed. They stood there in the darkness, two souls who had found each other in the most impossible of circumstances, and for a moment, the world outside did not matter. The threats, the violence, the blood that was surely coming, none of it could touch the quiet understanding that passed between them. But the moment could not last forever, and in the shadows beyond the farm, engines were starting, guns were being loaded, and old debts were being called in. The storm was coming, and this time it would not be rain that fell. The attack came on the seventh night, just as Vincent had predicted. Margaret had learned to read the signs, the way his men moved with increased urgency, the way their eyes constantly scanned the tree line, the way Vincent himself grew quieter, more withdrawn, like an animal sensing a storm on the horizon. She had stopped asking when it would happen and started preparing for the inevitable. They came at 3 in the morning, when the world was at its darkest and the mind at its weakest. Margaret was awake, had been awake for hours, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that pulled at her bones. She was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold when the first alarm sounded. A shrill electronic scream that shattered the silence. Vincent was at her side within seconds, his hand on her shoulder, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. It's time. Go to the basement. Now. Margaret had practiced this a dozen times over the past few days, but practice was nothing compared to the reality of it. Her legs felt like lead as she moved toward the basement door, Vincent close behind her. He opened it and guided her down the steps, his hand steady on her back. The basement had been transformed into a bunker. Food, water, medical supplies, everything they might need if the worst happened. There was a cot in the corner, a battery-powered radio, and a heavy steel door that Vincent had installed himself. He ushered her inside and turned to leave. Margaret grabbed his arm. Where are you going? Vincent looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. I have to go out there. I have to face this. Then I'm coming with you. No, Vincent said firmly. You stay here. You stay safe. That's the deal. Margaret's grip tightened, her nails digging into his sleeve. I didn't agree to hide while you go out there and get yourself killed. We said we'd face this together. Vincent knelt in front of her, his eyes level with hers, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. Margaret, if something happens to me out there, I need to know that you're safe. I need to know that this wasn't for nothing. Please, let me do this one thing right. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, tears she had not realized were falling. She wanted to argue, wanted to demand that he stay, that they barricade themselves in the basement and wait for it all to be over. But she saw the resolve in his eyes, the determination of a man who had spent his entire life making impossible choices and had finally found something worth dying for. She released his arm and nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Come back to me. Vincent stood and kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender it nearly broke her. I will. Then he was gone, the heavy door swinging shut behind him, the lock clicking into place. Margaret sank onto the cot, her body shaking with sobs she could no longer contain. Outside she could hear the muffled sounds of shouting, the crash of breaking glass, the sharp crack of gunfire. The war had come to her doorstep. Vincent emerged from the basement into a scene of controlled chaos. His men were already in position, taking cover behind furniture, peering through windows, their weapons drawn and ready. Marco, his most trusted lieutenant, was at the front window, his face grim. How many? Vincent asked. 10, maybe 12. They came in 4 cars, parked at the tree line. Tommaso's leading them. I can see him, boss. He's standing out in the open like he thinks he's untouchable. Vincent moved to the window and looked out. There, illuminated by the floodlights his men had installed around the property, stood Tommaso Carella. He was younger than Vincent remembered, maybe 40, with the kind of lean, hungry look that came from years of clawing for power. He wore a dark suit and held a pistol loosely at his side, his posture relaxed, almost casual. Behind him, spread out in a loose semicircle, were his men. They were armed with rifles and shotguns, their faces obscured by the shadows. They had not yet opened fire, but Vincent knew it was only a matter of time. Tommaso cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. "Vincent, I know you're in there. Come out and talk to me. Let's settle this like men." Vincent glanced at Marco. "He wants to talk." Marco snorted. "He wants to kill you in front of an audience. It's about respect, boss. He wants everyone to know he's the one who took down the great Vincent Salerno." Vincent considered this. Tommaso was ambitious, but he was not stupid. If he had wanted a straight massacre, he would have sent his men in already, overwhelming Vincent's smaller force with sheer numbers. The fact that he was calling for a conversation meant he was playing a different game, one that involved theatrics and symbolism as much as violence. "I'm going out there," Vincent said. "Boss, no," Marco protested. "That's suicide." Vincent turned to face him, and his voice was calm but absolute. "If I don't go out there, he'll burn this place to the ground with all of us inside. At least if I talk to him, I can buy us time. Maybe I can end this without more blood." Marco looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew better. He nodded reluctantly. "We'll cover you. If he tries anything, we'll light him up." Vincent nodded and walked to the front door. He paused, his hand on the knob, and took a deep breath. Then he opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and gun oil. Vincent walked slowly down the steps, his hands visible and empty, his posture unthreatening. He stopped at the base of the porch, about 20 feet from where Tommaso stood. "Tommaso," Vincent said evenly. "It's been a long time." Tommaso smiled, but it was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. "Vincent, you look old. Retirement doesn't seem to be treating you well. I'm alive." "That's more than I expected at this point." Tommaso laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Yeah, I heard about your little hideaway here, living on a farm with some old lady. What is this, Vincent, your redemption arc? You think you can just wash the blood off your hands by playing the hero?" Vincent did not rise to the bait. "I'm not looking for redemption. I'm just trying to live out the rest of my days in peace." "Peace," Tommaso repeated, as if tasting the word. "You don't get peace, Vincent. Men like us, we don't get happy endings. We get what we deserve, and you deserve to pay for what you did to my brother." "Your brother tried to kill me," Vincent said quietly. "He broke the rules. He betrayed the family. I did what had to be done." "You executed him," Tommaso spat, his calm facade cracking. "You put a bullet in his head and left him in a ditch like he was nothing. He was my blood, Vincent, my brother. And you took him from me." Vincent's expression softened, just a fraction. "I know, and I'm sorry for your loss, but if you came here for revenge, you're making a mistake. This won't bring him back. It'll just add more bodies to the pile." Tommaso's grip tightened on his pistol. "You think I care about that? You think I'm afraid of a few more bodies? I've waited 8 years for this, Vincent. 8 years of watching you walk away like you were above it all, like you could just decide you were done, and the rest of us would let you go. Well, I'm here to tell you that you don't get to walk away. You don't get to be free." Vincent took a step forward, and several of Tommaso's men tensed, raising their weapons. Tommaso held up a hand, stopping them, his eyes locked on Vincent. "What do you want from me, Tommaso?" Vincent asked. "You want me to beg? You want me to get on my knees and apologize?" "I'll do it. I'll do whatever you want. Just leave the woman out of this. She has nothing to do with our world. She's innocent." Tommaso's smile widened. "Innocent. That's a funny word coming from you. How many innocent people did you hurt, Vincent? How many lives did you destroy? And now you want me to spare one old lady because she's innocent? Where was your mercy when you killed Luca? Where was your compassion then?" Vincent's jaw tightened. "Luca made his choice. She didn't. She's just a woman who called the wrong number. Don't punish her for my sins." Tommaso seemed to consider this, tilting his head like a curious bird. "You care about her. I can see it." "That's interesting. I didn't think you were capable of caring about anyone." "I care," Vincent said simply. And if you hurt her, if you touch her, I will spend whatever time I have left hunting you down. I may be old, Tommaso, but I still have friends. I still have resources, and I will make you wish you had never been born." Tommaso's smile faded, replaced by cold fury. "You threatening me, old man? I'm promising you." The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Vincent could feel the weight of the moment, the knowledge that a single wrong word, a single misstep, could ignite the powder keg and turn this place into a slaughterhouse. Then Tommaso laughed, a genuine, almost delighted sound. "You know what, Vincent? I like you. I always did. You've got balls. I'll give you that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a choice. You come with me right now, no resistance, and I'll leave this place standing. The woman lives. Your men live. But you're coming back to the city with me, and you're going to answer for what you did, publicly, in front of everyone who remembers what you were. And if I refuse, then we burn it all down. We kill your men, we kill the woman, and we make sure that the last thing you see before you die is everything you tried to protect, turning to ash." Vincent felt the world narrow to a single point, a single choice. He could fight, could signal his men to open fire, and maybe they would take down Tommaso and a few of his soldiers, but the rest would overrun them, and Margaret would die, and everything he had tried to do, everything he had tried to be in these final days would be for nothing. Or he could go. He could surrender. He could walk into certain death and at least know that she would be safe. It was not really a choice at all. "All right," Vincent said quietly. "I'll go with you. But I want your word. Your oath on your brother's grave. The woman and my men walk away from this. No reprisals, no revenge. They're out." Tommaso nodded slowly. "You have my word." Vincent turned toward the house, where he knew Marco and the others were watching, their weapons trained on Tommaso and his men. He raised his hand in a simple gesture, a signal they had agreed upon. "Stand down. Let me go." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the lights inside the house went dark, and Vincent knew his men had understood. They would not fight. They would let him walk into the night, into whatever fate awaited him, because that was what he had ordered. He turned back to Tommaso. "Let's go." But before he could take a step, a voice cut through the darkness, high and clear and utterly unexpected. "No." Vincent froze. He knew that voice. He turned slowly, his heart sinking, and saw Margaret standing on the porch, the pistol he had given her clutched in both hands, her arms shaking but her stance firm. "Margaret." "No," Vincent said, his voice urgent. "Get back inside." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I told you. We face this together. I'm not letting you walk away to die for me. I won't let you." Tommaso laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. Well, the old lady has some fight in her, I like that. But sweetheart, you don't want to do this. Put the gun down before you get hurt." Margaret raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Tommaso. "If you take him, you'll have to take me too, because I'm not letting him go." Vincent moved toward her, his hands raised. "Margaret, please, you don't understand. This is the only way." "I understand perfectly," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "You think you're saving me by sacrificing yourself, but you're not. You're just leaving me alone again. And I'd rather die fighting beside you than live without you." Vincent felt something break inside him, something he had kept locked away for so long that he had forgotten it was there. He looked at this woman, this stranger who had become the most important person in his world, and he realized that she was right. They had found each other in the darkness, and if they were going to die, they would die together. He turned back to Tommaso, and his voice was steady. "The deal's off. You want me, you're going to have to come through her. And if you do that, my men will cut you down before you take another step. So what's it going to be, Tommaso? Are you willing to die for revenge?" Tommaso's expression hardened, and for a moment Vincent thought he would give the order, would unleash his men and turn this place into a battlefield. But then something shifted in his eyes, some calculation, some realization that this was not the victory he had imagined. He lowered his pistol and took a step back. This isn't over, Vincent, not by a long shot. But tonight you get to live. Because I want you to know what's coming. I want you to spend every moment from now until the end wondering when I'm going to come back. And when I do, I won't be so generous." He turned and walked back toward his men, gesturing for them to retreat. One by one, they melted into the darkness, and the sound of car engines echoed across the field. Then they were gone, leaving only the night and the silence, and the two people standing in the yard, alive against all odds. Vincent climbed the porch steps and gently took the pistol from Margaret's hands. She collapsed against him, her body shaking with sobs, and he held her, his own eyes wet with tears he had not shed in decades. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not letting me go." Margaret pulled back and looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes fierce. "We're in this together, until the end, no matter what." Vincent nodded. Together. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, they stood there, two survivors of a war that was far from over, holding on to each other like lifelines in a storm that would not stop until it had taken everything. But for now, they were alive. And that was enough. The weeks that followed Tommaso's retreat were deceptively quiet. Vincent knew better than to mistake silence for peace. The storm was building, gathering force in the shadows, and when it finally broke, it would be with a violence that would make the first attack look like a warning shot. He doubled the security, brought in more men, turned Margaret's farm into a compound that could withstand a siege. But no amount of preparation could ease the weight of knowing that every moment of calm was borrowed time. Margaret changed during those weeks. The frightened old woman who had dialed the wrong number was gone, replaced by someone harder, more resolute. She learned to shoot, to move quietly, to read the signs of danger that Vincent's world had taught him over a lifetime. She stopped sleeping through the night, kept the pistol within reach at all times, and developed the same watchful stillness that Vincent's men carried like a second skin. But she also smiled more, laughed more, as if the proximity of death had reminded her what it meant to be alive. She cooked meals for Vincent's men, learned their names and their stories, became a kind of mother figure to these broken soldiers who had never known what it was like to be cared for without expectation. And in the evenings, when the sun set over the fields and the world turned gold and red, she would sit with Vincent on the porch, their hands intertwined, and they would talk about things that had nothing to do with violence or revenge. They talked about her husband, about the life they had built together, and the quiet sorrow of watching him fade away. They talked about Vincent's childhood, the poverty and hunger that had driven him into the arms of the Mafia, the moment when he realized that power was the only thing that could keep the wolves at bay. They talked about regrets and what-ifs, and the strange mercy of finding connection in the twilight of life. One evening, 3 weeks after Tommaso's visit, Margaret asked the question that had been hanging between them like a ghost. "Do you think he's really going to come back?" Vincent was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yes," he said finally. "He has to. In our world, when you show mercy, it's seen as weakness. And weakness is blood in the water. Tommaso let us live, which means he lost face. The only way he can recover is to finish what he started, and he'll do it in a way that makes up for the humiliation." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Then we prepare, and when he comes, we show him that mercy isn't weakness. It's strength. The strength to choose who we want to be, even when the world tells us we have no choice." Vincent looked at her, and in that moment, he understood something he had spent his entire life running from. Love was not a weakness. It was the only thing that gave meaning to survival. It was the reason to fight, the reason to endure, the reason to believe that even in the darkest corners of existence, there was something worth protecting. "I love you," he said, the words foreign on his tongue, but truer than anything he had ever spoken. Margaret smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "I love you too." They sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon, and for a brief, perfect moment, the world was at peace. The final attack came on a cold October morning, just after dawn. This time there was no warning, no phone call, no dramatic confrontation. Tommaso had learned from his first attempt. He came with an army. 20 men, maybe more. descending on the farm from 3 directions. They came with rifles and shotguns and Molotov cocktails, and they came with the intention of leaving nothing standing. Vincent's men opened fire immediately, the crack of gunshots shattering the morning calm, and the farm became a war zone. Margaret was in the basement again, but this time she was not cowering. She sat at the table, the radio crackling with the voices of Vincent's men as they called out positions and threats, and she listened with the calm of someone who had accepted what was coming. Vincent had insisted she stay below, and this time she had not argued. She knew that her presence on the battlefield would only distract him, would make him vulnerable in ways that his enemies could exploit. But that did not mean she was helpless. She had spent the past 3 weeks learning the layout of the property, memorizing every exit, every hiding spot, every advantage. She had weapons down here, food, medical supplies, everything she would need if Vincent fell and she was forced to survive alone. But more than that, she had resolve. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. They would face this together, even if it meant she had to crawl through fire to reach him. Above her the battle raged. Vincent was at the front of the house, his rifle braced against his shoulder, firing with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. His men were scattered across the property, taking cover behind barns and vehicles, holding the line against overwhelming odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were fighting for something that Tommaso's soldiers could never understand. They were fighting for family, for loyalty, for the old man who had given them purpose when the world had cast them aside. Marco was at Vincent's side, his face streaked with dirt and blood, his eyes wild with adrenaline. "Boss, we can't hold them much longer. They're flanking us on the east side." Vincent nodded, his mind working through the tactical nightmare unfolding around him. "Fall back to the barn. We'll make our stand there. It's defensible, and we can bottleneck them at the door." Marco shouted orders, and the men began to retreat, laying down covering fire as they moved. Vincent was the last to leave, his eyes scanning the chaos for any sign of Tommaso. He knew the younger man was out there somewhere, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He found him standing at the tree line, flanked by 2 of his best soldiers, a smug smile on his face. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and Vincent saw the triumph in Tommaso's expression. He thought he had won. He thought this was over. Vincent raised his rifle, sighted down the barrel and fired. The shot went wide, intentionally kicking up dirt at Tommaso's feet. It was a message, a challenge. "If you want me, come and get me." Tommaso's smile faded, replaced by cold fury. He shouted an order, and his men surged forward, a wave of violence crashing toward the barn. Vincent turned and ran, his old legs protesting, his lungs burning, but he did not stop. He reached the barn just as Marco slammed the heavy doors shut, barricading them with steel bars and chains. The building shook as Tommaso's men threw themselves against it, but it held, for now. Vincent moved to the back of the barn, where a small door led to a tunnel he had spent the past 2 weeks digging with the help of his men. It was crude, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, but it led to the basement of the house, to Margaret. If they were going to die, they would die together. "Boss, where are you going?" Marco called out. Vincent paused at the tunnel entrance. "Hold them as long as you can. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, get out through the south exit and don't look back." Marco's face twisted with anguish. "Boss, no. We're not leaving you. That's an order," Vincent said, his voice hard. "You've been loyal, all of you, but this is my fight. Let me finish it." Before Marco could protest further, Vincent dropped into the tunnel and began to crawl. The space was tight, suffocating, but he pushed forward, driven by the singular need to reach Margaret, to see her one last time, to tell her that whatever happened, she had given his life meaning. He emerged in the basement, dirt and sweat covering his face, and found her waiting for him. She had heard the gunfire, had known he was coming, and she stood there with the pistol in her hand and tears streaming down her face. "Vincent," she whispered. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperation that bordered on pain. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I brought this to you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." Margaret pulled back and cupped his face in her hands. "You did protect me. You gave me something to live for. You made me feel like I mattered. That's more than anyone else ever did. Vincent kissed her, a fierce, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and smoke, and for a moment, the world outside did not exist. There was only this woman, this impossible, beautiful woman who had saved him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Then the building shook, a massive explosion ripping through the barn, and Vincent knew that Tommaso had brought the fire. "We have to go," he said, pulling Margaret toward the stairs. "There's a way out through the back. We can still make it." But Margaret did not move. She looked at him, her eyes clear and steady, and she shook her head. "No more running, Vincent, no more hiding. We end this here." Vincent stared at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You want to face him?" "Together," Margaret said. "We face him together." Vincent wanted to argue, wanted to drag her out of here by force if necessary, but he saw the resolve in her eyes and knew it would be useless. She had made her choice and he had no right to take it from her. "All right," he said quietly. "Together." They climbed the stairs, emerging into the kitchen just as the front door exploded inward. Tommaso stood in the doorway, flanked by his remaining men, his suit torn and bloodied, his face a mask of fury. He saw Vincent and Margaret standing side by side, and he laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The great Vincent Salerno hiding behind an old woman. Is this what you've become?" Vincent stepped forward, placing himself between Tommaso and Margaret. "I've become someone who understands what's worth fighting for. Something you'll never understand." Tommaso raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Vincent's chest. "Any last words?" Vincent glanced back at Margaret, and she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of encouragement. He turned back to Tommaso and his voice was calm. "Yes, forgiveness. That's my last word. I forgive you for what you're about to do. And I hope someday you'll forgive yourself." Tommaso's finger tightened on the trigger, and then a voice sharp and commanding cut through the tension. "Tommaso, enough." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, flanked by a dozen armed men, was an older man with silver hair and a face carved from granite. Vincent recognized him immediately. Don Marcello, the head of the council, the man who had taken over after Vincent stepped down. Tommaso's face went pale. "Don Marcello, what are you doing here?" Marcello stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the destruction, the bodies, the blood. "I'm here because you've forgotten your place, Tommaso. You've brought war to a man who walked away in peace. You've violated the agreement. You've shamed us all." Tommaso's grip on his pistol wavered. "But he killed my brother. He deserves to pay." "Your brother betrayed the family," Marcello said coldly. "Vincent did what was necessary, and when he stepped down, we agreed to let him go. You broke that agreement. You brought this war, and now you will answer for it." Tommaso looked around, realizing that Marcello's men had surrounded him, that his own soldiers had lowered their weapons in the face of superior authority. He was trapped, outmaneuvered, defeated. Marcello walked over to Vincent, his expression softening just a fraction. "I heard what happened. I came to make sure you were still alive, and to remind you that some debts are never forgotten. You earned your peace, Vincent. Go live it." Vincent nodded, too exhausted to speak. Marcello turned to Tommaso and gestured toward the door. "Come, we have much to discuss." Tommaso hesitated, his eyes burning with impotent rage, but he had no choice. He holstered his pistol and followed Marcello out, his men trailing behind him. Within minutes the farm was silent, the invaders gone, leaving only the wreckage of battle and the two people standing in the middle of it all. Vincent turned to Margaret, and she collapsed into his arms, her body shaking with sobs of relief and exhaustion. He held her, stroking her hair, whispering words of comfort that he barely understood himself. "It's over," he said. "It's finally over." Margaret looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dirt, and she smiled. "No," she said softly. "It's not over. It's just beginning." In the months that followed, Vincent and Margaret rebuilt. The farm slowly returned to life, the scars of battle fading beneath fresh paint and new wood. Vincent's men drifted away one by one, returning to their own lives, their own battles, but they left knowing that they had been part of something rare. They had witnessed loyalty and love in a world that valued neither. Vincent and Margaret grew old together, in the truest sense of the word. They tended the farm, planted gardens, watched the seasons change. They never spoke of the Mafia again, never looked back at the world Vincent had left behind. They lived simply, quietly, with a contentment that neither had thought possible. And when Vincent finally passed 15 years later, in his sleep with Margaret's hand in his, he went peacefully, without regret, knowing that he had found what every man searches for and few ever discover: a reason to be good, a reason to be loved, a reason to believe that even the darkest soul can find redemption in the arms of someone who sees them for who they truly are. Margaret lived another 5 years after that, surrounded by the community that had grown around her, the people who had come to know her as the woman who had tamed the wolf, who had shown them that love was stronger than fear. And when she finally joined Vincent, she did so with a smile on her face, ready to continue the conversation they had started on a stormy night when a wrong number became the most right thing that had ever happened to either of them. In the end, they were not remembered as a Mafia boss and a widow. They were remembered as two people who had found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful from the ruins. They were remembered as proof that it is never too late to start over, to choose differently, to become someone better than the world expects you to be. They were remembered as family. And in a world built on violence and betrayal, that was the greatest victory of all.